One of the things that we are learning as we go through the Gospel of Luke is that Luke is telling us a very specific kind of story. And we are trying our best to let Luke tell us the story the way Luke wants to tell us. We are not trying to make Luke conform to a version of the story maybe we prefer or that we're more familiar with. For instance, like the Gospel of John. Some of us, as a modern people, may be embarrassed or confused by passages like this. The idea of faith healing or miraculous healing intimidates some of us because we feel like it may have been hijacked by TV preachers who have made it a spectacle of hitting people on the forehead and knocking them down, right? Or taking people's monies as sort of a modern day indulgence or something. And so we're nervous about the whole idea of supernatural or miraculous healing. So we could sort of shy away from that. And then this casting out of demons seems somewhere between antiquated or in some previous era of understanding of humanity, and we're so much more enlightened now after the Enlightenment. And so we come to a passage like this, and I'll be honest with you, it would be really easy for us to say, oh, I don't like this part very much, and to turn until we get to some of the red letters, you know, where publishers have put the words of Jesus in red, and we really want to fast forward and get to the things Jesus says, because we sort of prefer Jesus as sage or teacher or mystic, and that's all fine, and we'll get to those. But today I just want to sit with Luke, and I want to look at how Luke is stitching together this story. We're using an analogy of quilting or cross-stitch, and we're letting Luke take these pieces of fabric, these different stories, and he's piecing them together because there's something Luke wants us to see. There's something about Jesus that Luke is trying to tell us. And so I just want to point out two seams or stitches that I find in this passage that I'm hoping you might find interesting. The first is, if you were here last week or if you read in that gospel, Jesus' first sermon did not go well, and the congregation tried to drive him off a cliff, and he barely slipped away, right? I just want you to see the contrast with his reception this week. When he preaches to those outside the religious establishment, notice the difference in back-to-back stories. Notice the difference of his reception. This week, the crowd loves what he is doing so much, they don't want to let him go. Last week, the crowd wanted to push him away and say, we cannot handle this, you get out of here. And this week, they're like, we love you. We want you to stay with us forever, right? And he says, listen, remember the thing I said about how God loves other people other than us? Well, I have to go to those other towns. It's sort of what I came to do. That's my job, my job description. I gotta let people know about God's goodness and God's love who may not have access to it through the religious establishment. And so he says, I gotta keep going. So that's an interesting contrast that Luke provides for us. Those within the walls of the synagogue cannot hear and actually repel Jesus' message, and those outside of the walls are drawn to it. So that's an interesting thing. But another seam that I find, or a stitch, is that Jesus, in a display of power, does two different kinds of healings. One is what we would call an exorcism, although that word has way too much baggage, so we don't like that. So we actually call it deliverance ministry. So we're going to say deliverance, although there's a film by that title that makes people sort of freak out. So we may have to find yet a third thing to call this. So let's say spiritual release. Let's say spiritual release, okay? But also physical restoration. And I think that Luke, if you read, is piecing these like a quilt, like a stitch. Luke is piecing these together and he's putting them side by side, and I think it's for one really simple reason. I think Luke wants us to know that God deeply cares about our health inside and out. The God that Jesus proclaims cares about your health inside and out. Can you hear that? Like, you matter to God, but your body matters to God. Your emotional health matters to God. Your spiritual vitality matters to God. Your mental framework, your relational connection, it all matters and is important. And when Jesus begins his ministry, one of the things that is so clearly Luke wants to make sure is in the Jell-O mold before it gets solidified, he wants to make sure that... You guys still make Jell-O molds? I know, I lost some of you there. You're like, a what? A what? One of the things Luke wants to make sure is in the concrete before it solidifies is this priority of health inside and out. So this is distracting for some of us, but I don't want us to get distracted by the difference between the first century that Jesus lived in and our 21st century, and I don't want to try and distance ourselves or discount the narrative that Luke is giving us. I actually want us to import the story and talk about how it looks for us. So here's my proposal today. You and I live in an incredible time where advances in modern science and in psychology and in so many other areas have come so far that we actually have the luxury of partitioning our spirituality to maybe one day a week or one place in the world or one activity. And I get that. But I just want to make sure that it doesn't get neglected when we celebrate modern medicine and how helpful it can be. Not always, but it can be. And in psychology, that through therapy and internal work, that there is great things that can happen for us psychologically and mentally, emotionally and relationally as we become healthier people and we connect to those in our lives, whether that's our family of origin and working through all that family stuff, or whether that is our friendship networks. I want to make sure that when we talk about mental health and physical health and relational connection, that we don't neglect the spiritual life. And so I'm going to propose that in the 21st century, when we talk about health and wholeness, maybe even healing, if we want to try and take that word back from its being hijacked by the TV preachers, that we're going to talk about it in 4 layers. And I think in those 4 layers, we have a really dynamic conversation so that when we attend to, how are you thinking about this? What are the emotions involved in that? How are you taking care of your carnitas, your carnal, right? The incarnation, right, of God's Spirit within you. And then the Spirit, how's your spirit with this? If we have those 4 layers of this, that's going to be our path forward into the kind of health and wholeness that Jesus, in his first century, that's the kind of wholeness and health that he's looking for. But for us, I'm just saying it's going to look a little different in the 21st century. We don't have necessarily the same worldview as those who Jesus was preaching to. We don't have the same worldview all the time. Sometimes through the scientific lens and the psychology lens and so many other things, it gets really muddy. But I think we've overcomplicated it, and that if we take it under the umbrella of health and wholeness, that we can say, in these 4 ways, God is deeply concerned with you as a whole person. And that if there are areas of your life that have been wounded maybe, or through regret or bad decisions, or through circumstances outside your control, whether it's biology or chemistry or hormones or whatever it is, that in all of these things, right, there's a texture that develops, and sometimes when there's unevenness, there's a shadow that can form. And in that shadow, right, in darkness, is where things sort of take on a life of their own, right? whether it's mushrooms or mold. Sometimes in the darkness, things take on a life of their own. And so part of the beauty of community and being really honest with each other is to say, here's what's going on with me mentally. Here's what's going on with me emotionally. Here's what's going on with me relationally. And here's what's going on with me spiritually. And by having that 4-tiered, layered conversation, we open the door as a community, not just as individuals, but as a community, to enter into the type of wholeness and health that God desires for us. So I want to encourage you today, don't get distracted by the differences between the first century and ours. There is a way for us in our modern world to address the exact kind of thing that Jesus was trying to bring to the surface for people to live in ways that lead to light and goodness and community connection, so that people aren't left on the margins, they aren't run over by the machine, they aren't left to fall through the cracks, but that as we form a healthy web of these 4 layers, we make sure that no one falls through the cracks and that everyone has their best chance to prosper into the kind of wholeness that God longs for, that God desires for us. And so that's a conversation I would love to have as we continue to go through Luke. And I'm hoping that if you're going to check out the Luke for Everyone, if you come to one of our small groups that meets during the week, as we continue to talk about Luke on Sundays, I'm hoping that this is a conversation that we're going to be able to flesh out together as a community and say, here's what that looks like for me. And as we compare notes, that we're going to flesh out and sort of fill out a bigger picture of what health and wholeness looks like in a technological 21st century. What does it look like to be the kind of people that we are both called and gifted to be? And that's a conversation I would really like to have with you. I'm going to ask if the choir will prepare to minister to us in song as the ushers prepare to take up the offering.